And I think it's that last point that I'd like to use to hand over to Nandita, who will be helping us to have a discussion around what does the nation of settler colonialism look like? What does it mean to call ourselves settler colonizers? And yeah, I think to really push us on our notions of what decolonization might mean and how we might view it. I have made you a co-host, Nandita, so you should be able to share your screen. If there's anything else that you need to let me know. And we are going from one session to the other, so if you need to turn off your camera, stretch, move around during the presentation, I'm sure that would be perfectly all right.
Hi, good morning, everyone. It's still morning in both of our places, which is amazing because I just jumped off another Zoom presentation in Italy, and I was watching their sunset as the sun here in Hawaii was rising. So that was really cool. So I'm going to start sharing my PowerPoint right now, just because I think it'll help us all stay focused. So I hope that you can still see me here, and I can still see each of you. So 1 second while I try and get this. Okay. So I'd like to first start off with a huge thank you to Aslam and all of the other organizers who I'm sure have worked incredibly hard to put together this event. And I very much appreciate the opportunity to participate. I very much was actually surprised when I received my invitation, because I have been very publicly critical of the framework of seeing migrants or people who are, perceived to be migrants, non-white people, for instance, in Canada or the United States, as settler colonists. So let me just begin. And I hope that the presentation helps explain where I'm coming from. So nationalism is inherently about, oh, wait a minute, sorry. Okay, I'll just start here, thank you. Nationalism is inherently about separation. As Ben Anderson showed us, nations are not only imagined as communities, national communities are always imagined as limited. No one nation can encompass all of the world's people, nor does it want to. Nationalism produces some, but never all people into a people. Nation states are also reliant on naturalizing a link between a certain people and a certain place. Nation states thus require the turning of land, water, and air into national territory. Those included in the nation become a people of a place, or more aptly, a nation with territory. Of course, not all people are a people, at least in the territories in which they actually live. Thus, nationalisms turn those excluded from what Bridget Anderson terms the national community of value into a people out of place. It is the figure of the migrant which established the limits of the nation. The migrant is defined by lack of political status, lack of national belonging, and the lack of a claim to territorial sovereignty. In international politics, the jealous guarding of the nation's people and its place has become a virtue. Codified in international law, rights within the global system of nation states are only as secure as one's relationship with the nation whose territory you are on. When people excluded from the heaven of national belonging live in territories imagined as not theirs, many see them to be threatening their national security. Ultimately, what they threaten is the security of nationalist identities, something that the national form of state power fosters to normalize its rule. In this presentation, I want to examine a particularly powerful and very uncanny aspect of the contemporary politics of separation: the national borders erected between people constituted as either natives or as migrants. While those placed in the colonial state category of native were once denied national status, often categorized as tribes or clans, not suitably advanced enough for the mantle of nationhood, nativeness today is increasingly coming to be seen as the ultimate and essential criteria for national belonging. Those categorized as migrants are, in this definition, quintessentially out of place. Separating people into categories of natives and migrants is no trifling matter. Their separation has and continues to animate some of the deadliest conflicts in our world. Even before mass killings began in June 2012, the separation of people into natives and migrants in Myanmar, formerly Burma, has been the ideological basis for what human rights observers believe is the world's most recent genocide. Rohingya people have been removed from the roles of Myanmar citizenship. Their homes and businesses have been looted and burned. Approximately 120,000 Rohingya people have been placed in what many classify as concentration camps, and hundreds of thousands of Rohingya have fled Myanmar to save their lives, all in the names of the indigenous rights of Burmese Buddhists in Myanmar. And of course, I just overheard the discussion of how since the coup d'etat in Myanmar, there's now an apology movement towards the Rohingya, and clearly that's not sufficient. In the Darfur region of Sudan, a populist Save Darfur movement has successfully reframed the economic, ecological, and political legacies of European imperialism into a conflict between indigenous Africans and migrant Arabs. In Rwanda in 1994, those acting in the name of native Hutus killed approximately 800,000 migrant Tutsis. The most potent and inflammatory label during the Rwandan genocide, and the one that was most often used to describe the Tutsis who were murdered, was that of colonizer. A not dissimilar process took place in the 1991 to 2002 Yugoslav wars. Ideas of native belonging fueled the claims to Serbian, Croatian, and Bosnian homelands. Those people targeted for ethnic cleansing were defined as foreign elements who were out of place in other people's national territory. 140,000 people were killed, and another 2 million people were displaced in the process. The ideological basis for the forced expulsion of Asians from Uganda in 1972 was the indigenization of Black Uganda. Claims to native rights to rule nation states also led to military coups d'etats aimed at unseating elected Asian parliamentary leaders in Fiji from the 1980s into the 2000s. And such a politics continues to shape violent xenophobic attacks on migrants in South Africa, where many of those targeted as outsiders are actually co-South African citizens, but not members of tribes who have been granted authority over territory and people at the subnational level. Xenophobia, of course, also informs white supremacist moral panics over immigrant invasions across Europe and in the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Thus, across the world, the legitimization of exclusion pivots around a politics of anti-migration done in the name of indigenous rights. The politics of separating natives from migrants is also evident in an increasingly popular discourse in the nation states of the former British white settler colonies, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, where the white in white settler colonialism has been dropped amid a growing chorus of opinion which asserts that all people who are non-native, including those racialized as Black, Asian, or Latinx, are settler colonists because they are migrants. Indigenous activist Sakej Ward has even said that, quote, the label settler is too historically and politically sterile, and that we are nothing less than occupiers. In these reformulations, migrants are held responsible for the colonization of natives. The stretching of the category of settler colonists to include those who were expressly excluded from white settler colonial projects is part of a politics centering indigenous national sovereignty over territory. So even though oftentimes it is land that is evoked and acknowledged, it is national territories which are being claimed through the discourse of indigenous sovereignty. Nationalisms within native nations define battles over who does and who does not belong. We can see this in the 1981 adoption of the Ganawage Mohawk Law and moratorium on mixed marriages, or the Marry Out, Get Out law, and in the efforts by the Cherokee Nation to expel Cherokee freedmen, descendants of Black people held as slaves by the Cherokees and brought with them on the Trail of Tears to the territories later defined as Cherokee National Territory. Both of these actions were overturned by courts in Canada and the United States, yet these efforts at limiting national membership demonstrate not only the racialized basis for the ideas of nations, including Native nations, but also the continuous process of culling or exclusion that is necessary to the making of nationhood. Although each of these examples that I've outlined has its specific historical, political, economic, social, and cultural context, what connects these different nationalist movements is their employment of a discourse of autochthony, in which the figure of the migrant is defined as the barrier to the realization of native national rule. That autochthonous discourses are plausible, that they can do political work in a remarkably wide set of circumstances, ranging from the far right to the social justice movements of some of the most subjugated and oppressed people on the planet, tells us something, I think, of the importance of autochthony to the contemporary character of power. Excuse me. The term autochthon is derived from the Greek autos, or self, and chthon, or earth, literally meaning one who has sprung from the earth, and it refers to an, quote, original or indigenous inhabitant of a place. Many of the key classical Greek theorists, Homer, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Euripides, all partook in the creation of the myth of autochthony as the basis of claims to rule. Like autochthony, the term indigenous also stems from classical Greek political theory. As Bambi Coupens and Peter Gescher note, to be indigenous means literally to be born inside, with the connotation in classical Greek of being born inside the house, i.e. being a master of the place. Those constituted as autochthons, or the indigenous, are seen to establish the limits of the political community. They are said to be rooted to particular lands or territories, and as such, the only one with inherent rights to govern it. This relationship is said to transcend earthly bounds, as it's seen as this relationship to politics and to place is said to be eternal. Aristotelian metaphysics aside, the production of autochthons is both an historical and a relational practice. Autochthons and their opposite, allochthons, belong to particular kinds of societies. Allochthon is also predicated on the Greek, in this case, the Greek allo, referring to that which is other or different, and the Indo-European allo, referring to someone or something else. First used as a geological reference, to be allochthonous was to be, quote, originating or formed in a place other than where found. In its modern usage, autochthony is founded on the ideological transformation of class into race. It is these associations, made most clear in the nationalist transformation of classes into masses, that gives indigeneity so much of its political purchase. As Jean Komaroff and John Komaroff have noted, the politics of autochthony or indigeneity is often a politics which appeals to those with very little, sometimes the least, in the nationalized societies they find themselves in. In any case, the indigenous has come to stand for the impoverished, the exploited, the subjugated race, while their binary opposite, migrants, have come to stand for those who dominate, expropriate, and exploit them. The conflict is presented as one between the from migrants are integral parts of what I have called the post-colonial New World Order. A post-colonial world is defined by the global hegemony of the national form of state power. Thus, post-colonialism, far from marking the end of the violent relationships of colonialism, marks instead the end of the legitimacy of imperial states. Post-colonialism is not an after to colonialism, and it is certainly not decolonization. Post-colonialism instead is a style of ruling that actively subsumes the collective anti-colonial energies of people into a new separated world order of nation states, and in so doing contains people's demands for liberation. Of course, some of the characteristics of post-colonial politics were formed in the period when imperial states were still hegemonic. Therefore, we need to pay attention to the imperial genealogy of the categories of both native and migrant. The OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, notes that in the late 14th century, a native from the Anglo-Norman naif was, quote, a person born in bondage, a person born to servants, tenants, etc., and inheriting their status. At this time, being native was a class position of subordination and servitude, and this meaning of it remained embedded in the later imperial category of native. By the end of the 17th century, other animals and plants, aside from humans, were beginning to be categorized as native as well. In the late 17th, early 18th centuries, the imperial state category of native was used to designate someone or something who naturally belonged in some place. They were of the land or territory. Native, of course, was the biopolitical category against which a bourgeois European identity was created. The earliest recording of European, according to the OED, was in the mid-16th century, and it was used to mark people as not colonized. Native was also the imperial category against which migrants were produced. A significant part of making migrants was undertaken in the mid-19th century when in various colonies in Asia and Africa, some colonized people were categorized as indigenous natives, while others were categorized as migrant natives. This bifurcation of the category of native was, as Mahmoud Mamdani has shown, a response to widespread revolts of natives in the colonies. And this was particularly the case with the 1857 rebellion in British India. I'm going to skip ahead here. I think I'm taking up too much time. The basis of the imperial distinction between indigenous and migrant natives intensified the idea that there existed a primordial relationship between a people and a given place. Natives, categorized as indigenous, were natured. They were portrayed as being a natural part of the land, and as such defined by stasis, not moving. Migrant natives, those people who were categorized as migrant natives, like, for example, the Tutsis, on the other hand, because they were represented as settlers from somewhere else, were defined by mobility. 19th and 20th century nationalisms in Asia and Africa took these imperialist ideas and retooled them to fit the nations that they were in the process of creating. In the post-colonial New World Order established after World War II, both colonizers and natives have been remade into national subjects, even as not all those who classify themselves as members of nations in either the colonies or in the imperial metropoles, former imperial metropoles, have been successful in gaining a nationalized sovereignty of their own. In the post-World War II era, being a nation was and remains the thing you must be. National subjectivities have to be both essentialized and territorialized in order, quote, to produce the effect of unity by virtue of which people will appear in everyone's eyes as a people. In this way, all nationalist projects can be said to deploy a discourse of autochthony, fixing both national subjects and their migrant others in time and space. national identity is an autochthonous identity, at least the successful nationalist projects. It is a key binary that organizes the world today. The principle that those people who can lay claim to being a people have the right to national sovereignty actually has formed the basis for the first major international political institution of post-colonialism, the United Nations. In its founding 1945 charter, the UN made the right of national self-determination the bedrock of international law. Hostility to migrants, on the other hand, was bred in the bone of this UN charter. With its declaration of the rights of people, with a capital P, to self-determination, it would not, nor could it, account for the rights of all those people who are not a people in the place that they live. But because the nation is always a nation in a world of nations, and each exists in a world prowled by capital, the nationalization of subjectivity requires an explanation not only of who we are, but who we are not as well. For each nation, exclusion becomes both a necessity and a virtue. Historical studies show us how this intensifies if and when national self-determination is achieved, supporting Edward Said's comment that, quote, in time, successful nationalisms consign truth exclusively to themselves and relegate falsehood and inferiority to outsiders. We know that limiting national belonging has, in many existing nation states, been achieved through processes of violent expulsion or extermination. However, the key and more banal technology for the realization and everyday production of post-colonial exclusion is the enactment of citizenship and immigration controls, preventing certain but not all people from lawfully entering national territory, all while deporting those who are denied lawful residency, has been and remains an indispensable part of limiting national belonging. Immigration controls or membership controls are what distinguish nation states from imperial states. Citizenship and immigration controls conquer has its own place in the world. In our post-colonial New World Order, nation states endlessly replay the fight against colonialism. This positions them as defenders of the nation rather than as the managers of ruling relations. This is why new colonizers have to be constantly invented, and why migrants, the quintessential people out of place in this international world order, can be represented as settler colonists invading native nations. I'll end it there. Just to conclude, I do believe that adopting the rhetoric that those of us who are not native in the places that we live and work are by definition contributing to the colonization of those people who are defined as native in the territories that we live and work in is part of a global hardening of nationalisms and a global intensification of anti-immigrant politics. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nandita. I think it's that final sentence that really clinched it for me. And I think when you and I first met, we had a strong back and forth around this. And I appreciate some of the nuance, and it was alluded to in one of our earlier sessions that, part of my presence in Canada, I think part of it has been this sort of guilt of, we're on native, indigenous, unceded land. And that therefore makes me part of the settler colonial project. Now, what do I do with this, right? And I think your argument that kind of pushes the direction that by using that discourse as opposed to naming white settler colonialism as something different from migration allows for a different sort of relationship and discourse to take place. If I have you correctly. There's a couple of hands and I'm sure a few questions and a rich discussion to follow. So Jabala had a question, and then Shadab, and then Nabila.
Again, not a question, just another comment. Thank you for pushing us beyond Turtle Island. Thank you for pushing us beyond borders, because as tribal people, we remember that maybe the immigrants will come to us and thank you for letting us be on your land. But really, our belief is that this is all our land, but we're just stewards of the land. And that land isn't just here on Turtle Island. We're not just natives to where we live. We're natives to the earth, to Mother Earth. Thank you so much for that, Nandita.
Thank you. Thank you.
Professor Sharma, thank you for your presentation. I really appreciate your presence here, because I think you're providing a really different perspective and in a really challenging way. And I very much appreciate what you're saying about a racist popular discourse and systems and institutional systems that are setting up migrants as invaders in juxtaposition to sort of an organic native presence. Like I get that. I get what you're saying. But at the same time, if we talk about the state of Israel, for example, right? And we think about these aliyahs, these waves of Jewish migration into Palestine, nowadays one thinks of rich American Jews from New York claiming birthright, right? And the audacity of calling it birthright, linguistically, right? They're denying the right of return to go to Palestine and to move to Palestine. That's not the quintessential demographic of these aliyahs. If you look at the early aliyahs before the Holocaust, you're looking at disenfranchised Jews coming from the Pale of Settlement. I mean, this was a dreadful space, and they are coming as migrants, as refugees, seeking refuge in a land that isn't theirs. But at the same time, that doesn't take away from the settler colonial and apartheid character of the state of Israel, right? And that's what I wanted to ask you. Are we talking about a weaponry, an institutional discourse that is used to demonize and destroy a community? Or are we talking about reality? Because when I see my subject position as a settler, I'm talking about an existential reality that has ethical implications in terms of me towards the indigenous people of the land, right? So I wanted to seek some clarification from you in that regard. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a really important one. And again, I'm going to draw on the work of Mahmoud Mamdani in his latest book. What is the title here? The title of his latest book.
Neither Settler Nor Native. Neither
Settler Nor Native. Thank you, Aslam. And he makes a very important and much needed distinction that is not being made in this discourse of everyone is a settler colonist who is not a native in the places they live and work. So he makes a very important distinction between settlers and immigrants in this new book of his. And he has an entire chapter devoted to Israel in that book that, if you haven't already read it, is very well worth reading. Immigrants, Mahmoud Mamdani argues, are unarmed. Settlers come armed with both weapons and a nationalist agenda. Immigrants come in search of a homeland, not a state. For settlers, there can be no homeland without a state. For the immigrant, the homeland can be others are at most tolerated guests. So when we're talking about the history of migration in today's Israel, prior to 1948, there was a great deal of immigration to the Palestinian mandate that was governed by the British Empire. And Jewish people came there prior, outside of the Zionist project. I'm not saying that, I'm not talking about, are their descendants today part of the Zionist project in Israel? Some of them are opponents of the Zionist project of Israel. But what I am saying is that historically, all immigrations of Jewish people into Palestine was not part of a Zionist nation building state project. And if we don't recognize that, then we're not actually paying attention to what was uniquely violent and devastating about the Zionist nation building project of Israel. And you could say the same thing about any other nation state. Now, of course, it shouldn't be lost on any of us that what is animating the legitimacy of the Zionist project and of the Israeli state project, right, and its violence, is the fact that Jewish people claim an indigenous relationship to that territory. Now, you can argue that that's nonsense, but what it does also reveal to us, which is also prevalent in Burma, in Canada, in France, is the fact that anyone can claim indigeneity. This category of indigenous is actually an empty signifier, right? In the sense that it can be mobilized by people. It can be mobilized by Marine Le Pen, the leader of the National Front in France, who claims that she is a native person of France and is sick and tired of all of these immigrant colonizers who are invading her homeland, right? It can also be used by white people in Canada to say that they are the true natives of Canada. They can also mobilize the discourse of indigeneity by arguing that, in the kind of imperialist rhetoric, that they were the first to civilize or improve the territory, right? And of course, it can be mobilized by the most subjugated, oppressed people on the planet, right? Who can mobilize the category of indigenous, which has a genealogical relationship to the imperial state category of native, right? They can also mobilize indigenous because, in my argument, indigeneity becomes really important in the post-World War II period, precisely because it concretizes claims to nationhood and to national territory. Claiming that you are the people of a place becomes essential to claiming national self-determination, and indigeneity is the surest route towards making that claim.
Super duper quick follow-up question. I'm sorry to take up space, but if you look at the Pied Noir, who were so violent in French Algeria, they didn't come as conquerors. They came as second-class citizens in France. The white supremacist Richard Spencer claims that his ancestors were conquerors, right? But if you look at the history of colonial America, a lot of the people who have genocide on their hands were fleeing persecution in Europe. What I'm saying is that doesn't take away from their settler colonial subject position. So that was the point that I'm making. And I think it is very difficult when you get to the existential level as opposed to state policy and weaponry.
Yeah, and I think that's why I'm very concerned with the fact that white has been dropped out of the white settler colonial project, right? Because certainly what happened, for instance, in the British white settler colonies and what happened in Algeria, right, was that you are absolutely correct that many of the people who came to Canada or the United States or Australia or New Zealand or Algeria were not the people who were directing the imperial project, right? They were also victims of that same imperial state in its quote unquote home, right? In its metropole, right? They also had land taken from them. Their labor was also exploited. They were also criminalized, put onto ships and sailed off somewhere, to do the backbreaking work of building these imperial colonies, right? The difference, however, between the Pied Noirs or white settler, the people that we call white settler colonists in Canada, is of course that they were brought into the imperial project through the shared identity of Europeanness, right? Through the shared identity of whiteness. And we know that the building of the Canadian nation state was the building of a white nation state. Also, there was the same for Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, right? South Africa, Rhodesia, right? All of these British white settler colonial states. So, I think that is a key distinction. If you were to argue that people of color or people who were brought here as slaves, people who were brought here as coolie laborers are now in the same position that white people were in the 18th, 19th century, I would beg to differ, right? And and just to switch gears just a little bit, and I'll wrap up because I see a lot of hands up, is that if we are to say that any time you are being used as part of a broader political agenda that is not your own, right? Part of a larger project of exploitation and expropriation that is not your own, that you therefore are complicit in it, then we would have to include everyone, right? Not just people who are not native to a place. We would have to include those people who are, you know, in our everyday lives, each and every one of us is entrapped within this system of capitalism. We are entrapped within this system of nation states. We are entrapped within systems of patriarchy. We are entrapped within systems of racism. And to say that simply being in those systems makes you somehow the mover and shaker in that system, the person who should be held responsible for that system, I think is a kind of dead end trap for activism.
Nabila and then Rita.
Okay, hi, I'll try to be quick. So thank you, Professor Sharma, for this amazing and informational talk. I would like to know your opinion on Sunera Tobani's Exalted Subjects, you know, where she claims that the immigrants do enjoy a more exalted status than the indigenous people, and they don't contest it. And they keep on benefiting from the exploitation of the indigenous. And in my opinion, like, immigrants don't even realize it if this claim is true. So I would just like to hear your thoughts on Sunera Tubani's stand on this.
Yes, yes, my dear old friend Sunera, I would disagree with that argument, right? I would say that, you know, as an organizer, as a political activist, I cannot say that those people who are not part of a movement today are to be condemned because they are not part of a movement, right? It is my job as an organizer, as an activist, as someone who is seeking justice, right? Who is part of an anti-colonial struggle, right? Who is part of an anti-capitalist, anti-patriarchal, anti-racist struggle, in my case, for a planetary commons. It is my job to bring people in, right? I can't just say, oh, look at you, you're not part of this struggle, right? And therefore you are part of the problem. No, the problem is that we don't have enough organizers, right? We don't have enough people on the left who are actually doing the hard work of organizing. Organizing is not the same as holding a demonstration on the street, right? And holding up placards. Organizing is talking to people and bringing them into the movement by showing all of us that we would be much better off if we lived in an absolutely different system, right? A system in which indigenous people are not subjugated, oppressed, exploited, expropriated, right? That's part of movement building. That's part of social justice activism. It's not okay just to say that if you're not in the movement, you're not there, because of course, many people who are also indigenous are also not part of any social justice movement just by virtue of the fact that they're indigenous. Now, would we say that they too are complicit in the project of colonization? I don't think so. So if we can't say that, then we shouldn't say that anyone can be outside of our movements. We can all be in this movement, but we have to do the hard work of organizing.
Thank you.
Rita, do you want to go ahead and then answer?
Hi, everybody. My name is Rita Damoon, and I first kind of want to say I'm really hesitant about speaking up. I only heard about this event this morning. I really wanted to listen to Muslim thinkers and scholars. And then I got a message from Muslim friends who are listening and are deeply upset with what they are hearing. So I'm speaking up for a number of reasons. I have written about some of the topics that you, Nandita, hello Nandita, have written about. I think that it's very dangerous and deeply conservative, what is being offered here in this presentation. It is premised and hinged on the idea that Indigenous people need to disappear. So I don't have a question, but I just want to flag for those of us who are trying to really think in a much more nuanced way, that politically, I object to the argument that's been made. It requires a denial of Indigenous people's land. It requires Indigenous people to disappear. Ontologically, I object to this argument that is being made, that the assumptions and the ways that you have defined indigeneity, the way you have defined land, defined nationhood, and defined citizenship are deeply Eurocentric. You don't ontologically in your work allow us to think about other conceptions of land, of citizenship, of nationhood. Thirdly, I want to object because I wonder what your citational politics is here. It feels like the work of Mamdani, Fanon, and others is being manipulated to serve your work, and which critical Indigenous scholars are really being taken up. And finally, I just want to say that conceptually, I think you're right, that there has been a problem with the binary of settler and non-settler, and I've contributed to that in some of my own work, which I've really been trying to unthink in lots of ways. But it's very much about getting away from this notion of identity, in which migrants can either only be the oppressed or the oppressor, or Indigenous people can only be the oppressed or the oppressor, and instead thinking about relationships. What are relationships to one another? And there are examples of that already happening. The Musqueam in 2014 hosted 376 South Asians in Vancouver to mark the 100-year anniversary of the Comagata Maru, a ship that arrived with South Asians. They welcomed them to say, this is how we would have greeted you on this territory. And then when Indigenous people and Anishinaabe people come to Lekwungen territory where I live, they too go through protocols. So I think there are ways to imagine a different kind of world that doesn't reify the kinds of divisions that this work is doing, which I find profoundly dangerous. And so I really did not want to speak, but I feel compelled to do so. Thank you.
Well, I would like to respond to that by saying that this is not, I consider myself to be trying to strengthen and advance the project of anti-colonialism, not to discredit it or to delegitimize it. However, where I would differ from you, Rita, in this is that I do think that we need to actually pay attention to how ideas of Indigenous identity are being used in order to stake claims to land, which I would argue are not really about land, but are about territory, because, you know, it might require a larger conversation. What is the difference between land, which sustains life, and territory, which organizes political community and sovereignty? But I would differ from you to say that I am being Eurocentric in my criticism of the categories of native or Indigenous or sovereignty or nationalism, et cetera. I know that many Indigenous scholars, who I do cite in my work quite extensively, many Indigenous scholars have said that their conceptualizations of nationhood, of sovereignty, are distinct and, you know, completely the opposite of the way that quote unquote Western scholars have said that they are. But I have yet to see what the distinction is. I think that if you are saying that there is a group of people by virtue of their identification, which is through genealogy, right, through bloodlines, that there is a group of people who have an inherent and primary governance over a particular place, that is part of the transformation of how land, which is the sustenance of life, becomes the territory of a group of people who define themselves as a nation. And that is something that Indigenous people, not all Indigenous people are nationalist, but many of the key Indigenous scholars who are saying that their ideas of nationhood and sovereignty are different than Western ones are, right? They are literally claiming indigenous national territorial sovereignty. Those are their terms. Those are not my terms. And to say that because it is indigenous people making those claims, and they are saying that they're making those claims outside of the same kind of conceptual framework that Western philosophers make, I just disagree with, because I haven't seen where the distinction is. How do we explain Mohawk marry out, get out laws? How do we explain the Cherokee trying to remove descendants of their former slaves from membership in the Cherokee Nation because they're not real Indians? How do we explain all of that? And then at the same time say that there are different conceptualizations of land, of nationhood, of sovereignty, right? I think we need to pay attention to that. And I think that we need to pay attention to this at a worldwide level, right? I think what is dangerous right now is how indigeneity is being used to legitimize and mobilize genocide. That's dangerous, right? It would be difficult, you know, and I do draw on the work of Mahmoud Mamdani, who did fantastic work to argue that, you know, the main organizational political framework of the Rwandan genocide was this distinction between settler and migrant. Between native and migrant, right? Between native and settler, a process that was initiated by the imperial states that governed what is now Rwanda, right? So we need to pay attention to that, and to simply ignore it and just say that there is absolutely no danger in claiming indigenous territorial sovereignty. I think that is where the real danger lies.
We're nearing the end of our time, and I know that this is a very heated discussion, and I suspect it's one that will not be resolved within the next 9 minutes, but definitely continue for, if not many generations after this, as we debate and try to find nuance and truth. But I also want to recognize that I do believe good intention on all sides, and I think it's a good way to debate and try to figure out how we get there and what the different paths to that might be. Ifrit, your point?
I'll just be brief. It's so good to see Rita and Nandita, who I haven't seen in so long. So it's, I'm a product of multiple generational migrations, from Iraq to India to East Pakistan to West Pakistan to Canada over many generations. So I understand my own sense of connection to space and land and diaspora is not the same as many people who write about it, because I don't necessarily think of myself as part of a diaspora all of the time. However, I think that we need to problematize this idea that there is some kind of, and I'm not sure this isn't exactly what you were saying, Nandita, that there's an innocence to racialized settler migrants, because there is, I think that the way that I'll speak about Canada specifically, the way that the Canadian state manipulates or deploys a multiculturalist discourse of a Canadian nation state definitely pulls racialized migrants into a hierarchy that in which we benefit from the dispossession of Indigenous people. And I think understanding how that process works, understanding how we are part of that process, and understanding how we ourselves use that process to gain legitimacy, power, sense of belonging, sense of identity, you know, not necessarily that those are bad things to want, but the way that they work in this particular context is implicated in a discourse of dispossession and anti-Indigenous racism often.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's no, there is no discounting of the enormous violence and injustice that has been done to Indigenous people, right, in Canada. That's not my point. The point is, what do we do with the fact that we are all here, right? What do we do with that? Do we, what I would argue we should do with that is to see how we can build a better world together, right? How can we, and many people are advancing that project, right? Many people are working across these boundaries of native, migrant, the racialized categories, nationalized categories, right? Many people are doing that. That's, what I'm specific, what my work right now is geared towards is revealing some of the dangers of not working across those categories, remaining in those categories, and seeing the only kind of relationship that can happen as one of allyship, right? Which is as Ruthie Gilmore has pointed out, that idea of allyship is extremely problematic, because not only is it a militarized language, right? I'm your ally, but it's also one that denies the fact that in order to build the world that we want to have, we are going to have to build a world in which the existing categories, especially those identifications that have been imposed upon us by imperial states, by nation states, need to be thoroughly questioned and rejected, right? So when I'm talking, like, I'm a migration scholar, I fully believe in the fact that we should not be identifying as migrants. We are not migrants. Migrants is a state category, right? And certainly I would not argue that the end of our political horizon should be arguing for Canadian citizenship, right? Or, to have a sense of belonging as Canadian. No, absolutely not. But I would argue that I am very concerned about a worldview that sees that the world is made up of nations, each of which has their own particular place in the world, and that your relationship to places that you're not native in is always one of a guest in which the native people host you and welcome you. I think that relationship is one that replays existing power plays, right? It doesn't actually challenge existing power plays. It reenacts the kind of host-guest relationship that underpins all nationalisms, that underpins all border controls, that underpins all immigration controls. How do we actually live in a world in which we all have the ability to sustain our lives on the land, right? Instead of a world in which we are all only supposed to have a life on the land that has been defined as our land, right? Because that's our national homeland. Like, I think that I know I'm getting a bit rambly and I may not be making sense anymore, so I apologize, but I would argue that there is a way out of the mess, the very, enormous messes that we're in, that there is actually an anti-colonial project that can achieve what everyone who has ever fought for that ever wanted, right? When we talk about anti-colonialism, what are we talking about, right? Is it national liberation? We have over 70 years of successful national liberation struggles, right? All of them have been a fucking nightmare, right? All of them have been a nightmare, right? My grandparents were part of the, anti-imperialist struggle against the British Empire in what is now called India. And what did they get? They got India, right? Look at that. Like, that's not decolonization, right? That is post-colonialism. That is a post-colonial rule of national, of capitalists and fascists who organize themselves as, heads of a nation and justify, their incredibly violent practices through that. So how do we actually get an anti-colonialism worthy of its name? How do we get an anti-colonialism that gives land back? How do we get an anti-colonialism that stops the exploitation of people's labor, right? How do we get an anti-colonialism that stops the practices of denigration, that stops the practices of hierarchically organizing people according to different categories? That's decolonization. And I don't think that existing national sovereignty struggles are going to be any different than past national sovereignty struggles. I have no reason to expect that if the Hawaiian nation was to achieve national sovereignty today, that in 70 years' time, they too would not be living through the nightmare that people in India are living through, right? So I think that we need a new politics of decolonization, one that is not nationalist, that is not based on exclusionary ideas of political belonging, of political governance.